You are still the poorest in this family, my father mocked at our formal Christmas dinner, his voice cutting through the silence of the dining room. My sister laughed, the sound echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Just then my phone buzzed on the table. I answered it on speaker, and the bank officer said clearly, "Ma'am, your account balance has reached $400 million." The entire room stopped breathing, and my sister's wine glass dropped to the marble floor. My name is Vanessa, and at 33 years old, I am the black sheep of the Kensington family. For years I sat quietly while they paraded their wealth and diminished my worth, treating my career as a joke and my life as a cautionary tale. Before I take you through the holiday dinner that permanently destroyed their perfect facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that the best way to handle toxic relatives is to let your success speak for itself. Growing up in the Kensington household meant learning early on that love was entirely transactional. Our family estate in the affluent suburbs of Chicago was designed to impress outsiders rather than comfort the people living inside it. My father, Thomas, built a logistics empire, and he demanded that his children reflect his immense success. He valued ruthless ambition, aggressive social climbing, and visible wealth. I was the quiet one, the daughter who preferred coding and data analysis in my bedroom over attending country club mixers. My mother, Barbara, spent her life accommodating Thomas's massive ego. Together, they cultivated an environment where my younger sister, Brittany, thrived as the undeniable golden child. This particular Christmas dinner was no exception to their usual theatrics. The massive mahogany dining table was draped in crisp white linen and set with fine china. A towering Christmas tree loomed in the corner, casting a warm glow over the 12 guests seated around the table. I sat near the end, feeling completely out of place in my simple tailored dress, especially compared to Brittany, who was draped in designer silk and flashing a new diamond bracelet her husband Derek had bought for her. I had brought a homemade pecan pie, a peace offering, that was currently sitting untouched and mocked on a side table. The evening had been filled with the usual subtle digs. Thomas would ask leading questions about my tiny one-bedroom apartment downtown, his tone dripping with condescension. Brittany would offer backhanded compliments about how brave I was to live without a financial safety net. I responded with polite nods and neutral answers, a survival mechanism I had perfected over the past 15 years. I was used to being the family punching bag, the baseline against which they measured their own superiority. But nothing could have prepared me for the cruelty of what my father had planned for dessert. As the plates were being cleared, Thomas stood up at the head of the table. He picked up his crystal wine glass and tapped it firmly with a silver spoon. The sound immediately silenced the room. Conversations halted, and all eyes turned toward the patriarch of the family. Instead of a holiday greeting, Thomas reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, legally bound document. With a swift, aggressive motion, he tossed the heavy stack of paper down the length of the table. It slid across the polished wood and landed directly onto my dinner plate with a loud thud, knocking over my crystal water glass. I flinched as cold water spilled across the white tablecloth and soaked the edge of the legal pages. I stared down at the document, the bold black letters on the cover page spelling out the revisions to the Kensington Family Trust. A heavy silence blanketed the dining room. I looked up from the wet paper to find Thomas staring at me with a look of absolute disgust. "I am officially writing you out of the family trust, Vanessa," he announced, his voice booming. The entire table watched me. My mother looked down at her lap, refusing to make eye contact, silently complicit as always. Thomas continued his public execution without missing a beat. "You are 33 years old, and you are still playing make-believe with your life. You call yourself a freelance data consultant, but we all know that is just a polite way of saying you are unemployed and broke." I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. "You live in a tiny, depressing apartment," Thomas sneered, pointing a finger at me. "You bring homemade baked goods to a formal dinner like some sort of peasant, while your sister provides a $5,000 catered feast. You are a financial liability to the Kensington legacy, and I will not have the wealth I built squandered by a daughter who refuses to contribute to our status." Across the table, Brittany let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She leaned back in her chair, lifting her wrist to adjust her sparkling diamond bracelet, ensuring the light caught the gems perfectly. "Do not act so surprised," Vanessa Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You have always been jealous of my achievements. It is just like high school. I bring home the trophies, the connections, and the valuable network, and you bring home participation certificates. Dad is just protecting the family legacy from someone who shops at thrift stores. The family should not have to subsidize a failure just because we share the same last name." The rest of the guests sat frozen, waiting for me to crack. They expected me to flee the room in shame, or perhaps drop to my knees and beg Thomas for forgiveness. They wanted a performance of desperation to validate their own superiority. But I did not give them one. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or defend my career choices. Instead, I reached forward and calmly picked up a linen napkin. I wiped the spilled water off the heavy legal document, smoothing down the edges with methodical precision. I folded the document neatly in half and slid it straight back across the mahogany table toward my father. "Keep it." "Thomas," I said, my voice perfectly level. I dropped the honorific of Dad intentionally. "I do not need your charity. I certainly do not need your money to pay my rent. And I refuse to be a prop in your pathetic power trips anymore." My calm dismissal was the ultimate insult. Thomas's face turned a violent shade of red. He slammed his fist down hard on the table, making the silverware rattle. "You ungrateful wretch," Thomas screamed. "You do not have a single dime to your name. You pretend you do not care, but you will be begging me for a loan by New Year's Eve when you cannot afford your pathetic lifestyle." At that exact second, cutting through the tension of my father's rage, my cell phone rang. Maintaining my absolute composure, I tapped the screen and placed the call on speakerphone, turning the volume up for the room to hear. "Am I speaking with Vanessa Kensington?" the voice on the line asked. The audio was crystal clear, cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. "Yes, this is Vanessa. Ms. Kensington, this is Arthur Caldwell, Senior Acquisition Officer at Global Financial Holdings. I apologize for calling on a holiday, but I knew you would want to hear this news immediately. The final signatures have been verified by our legal team, and the ink is officially dry. I am calling to confirm the acquisition of your data security algorithm is completely finalized. The post-tax wire transfer of $400 million has cleared into your private account. Congratulations on the sale." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I will speak with your transition team on Monday morning. Enjoy your holiday." I tapped the red button to end the call and set my phone face down on the table right next to the damp legal document my father had just thrown at me. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody breathed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, amplifying the tension. Then the fragile illusion of their perfect holiday shattered completely. Brittany's hand simply went limp. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her manicured fingers and crashed onto the polished marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed off the high ceiling, sending a spray of dark red wine across the hem of her expensive silk dress and splashing onto her designer shoes. She did not look down at the mess. Her mouth hung slightly open, and her eyes were locked on my cell phone as if it were a live explosive device. Beside her, my mother dropped her heavy silver fork. It clattered loudly against her fine china plate. Barbara sat completely frozen, her eyes darting frantically between me and my father, unable to process the numbers she just heard. Her perfectly curated posture dissolved into a rigid slump of utter disbelief. Thomas looked as though all the blood had been instantly drained from his body. The man who had just stood towering over me, screaming about my pathetic lifestyle and impending financial ruin, was now slumped back in his oak chair. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry sound came out. He reached blindly for his Scotch glass with a trembling hand, his fingers grazing the rim before pulling back. The color completely vanished from his face. I remained perfectly still, resting my hands neatly in my lap. The stark contrast between my absolute composure and their complete unraveling felt incredibly satisfying. I let them sit in their overwhelming shock for a long, agonizing minute. I watched them struggle to comprehend the reality of the situation before I finally broke the silence. I suppose I should clarify a few minor details, I said, keeping my voice conversational and entirely devoid of desperation. My freelance consulting was just a cover. I was the sole founder and creator of a stealth cybersecurity startup, building an impenetrable fraud detection algorithm from scratch. I paused, letting the reality wash over them completely. My work is what every major bank in America just adopted to secure their global transactions. It is a highly specialized piece of software designed to identify and neutralize sophisticated offshore financial breaches before they can drain corporate accounts. I let my gaze drift to Brittany, who was still staring at me in pale disbelief. The dark wine was soaking into her expensive dress, but she remained completely paralyzed. The sister who had just mocked my thrift store clothes was now staring at a newly minted billionaire. The banking industry takes financial liability very seriously, I continued. Every major financial institution in the country has been bidding on the exclusive rights to my software. Global Financial Holdings won the bid last night. So when you look at my tiny apartment, Thomas, and mock my wardrobe. Brittany, you should know I was not failing. I was quietly building a digital fortress. I did not want the distraction of wealth while writing the code. I just wanted the work to be perfect. Thomas stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He blinked several times, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the disappointing daughter he had just discarded with the reality of $400 million. The staggering sum was more liquid capital than his entire logistics empire had generated in its best decade. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. And then right before my very eyes, the silent shock began to slowly curdle into something far more predictable and ugly. The utter disbelief completely faded, and a desperate, ravenous greed rushed in to take its place. My mother was the first to pivot. Barbara's rigid posture suddenly softened. The woman who had sat silently while my father humiliated me, the woman who had never once defended my career choices, suddenly pushed her chair back and stood up. Her face broke into a wide, frantic smile. She hurried around the edge of the large table, stepping carelessly over the broken glass and spilled wine near Brittany's chair. She practically threw herself toward me, her arms outstretched in a sudden, desperate attempt to pull me into a tight maternal hug. "Oh, Vanessa, my darling," Barbara exclaimed, her voice pitching up into a forced, joyous register. "We always knew you were a genius. We always knew you had this incredible potential inside of you. We are so incredibly proud of you." I leaned back in my chair, avoiding her embrace. She caught herself on the edge of the table, her hands gripping the polished wood. She did not seem to notice my physical rejection. Her eyes were wide, gleaming with a frantic, calculating light. She wasn't seeing her daughter, she was seeing a bank. The realization that they viewed me merely as a convenient financial resource solidified my resolve. The years of feeling inadequate melted away, replaced by a cold certainty. I knew exactly who I was now, and I knew exactly who they were. "This is absolutely perfect timing," Barbara continued, the words spilling out of her in a rush. "It is a true Christmas miracle. You see, your sister has been going through a terrible time lately. We did not want to burden you with family stress while you were working hard, but Brittany's husband, Derek, desperately needs a $10 million bailout for his commercial real estate firm. The market has been cruel to them, and his investors are threatening to pull out." She reached out, trying to grab my hand, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. $10 million is just a tiny drop in the bucket for you now, Vanessa. It is barely a tiny fraction of what you just made today. You can write the check tonight and save your sister's marriage. You have the power to fix absolutely everything for our family right now." I looked from Barbara's desperate, smiling face over to Brittany. My younger sister had finally recovered from her shock. She was no longer looking at me with disdain or pity. She was looking at me with a fierce, burning expectation, as if the money sitting in my bank account had always belonged to her. The golden child who had spent the entire evening mocking my lack of a safety net was now fully expecting me to become hers. I took a step backward, allowing my mother's arms to close around empty air. The audacity of the request hung over the table like toxic smoke. 2 minutes had passed since my father publicly disowned me, tossing legal documents at my face. Now she was asking for $10 million. I looked at Barbara's grasping hands, then at Brittany's expectant face, and felt the last thread of guilt snap cleanly inside me. I am not writing a check for Derek, I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly across the dining room. I am not writing a check for anyone. Not tonight. Not ever. The polite veneer of the dining room shattered. Brittany sprang from her chair so violently that the mahogany legs scraped loudly against the marble. Her perfectly curated socialite persona completely evaporated. She stood breathing heavily, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The diamond bracelet on her wrist clinked aggressively against the table edge as she slammed her hands down. "Are you kidding me?" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking in a high pitch. "You have $400 million sitting in your bank account right this second, and you are going to let my husband go bankrupt. You selfish, ungrateful witch. Family helps family, Vanessa. That is how this works. We are your family, and you owe us." I met her furious gaze without flinching. "Family helps family," I repeated, letting the words echo against the crystal chandeliers. "That is a fascinating concept, Brittany. Please tell me, did family help family when I was struggling to pay my heating bill last winter and you laughed telling me to get a second job? Did family help family 20 minutes ago when Thomas threw documents at my head and called me a peasant while you cheered? You do not want a family, you want a massive ATM, and I am closed for business." My refusal triggered something primal inside my sister. She marched around the table, her designer heels crushing the shattered wineglass deeply into the expensive rug. "You owe me this," she screamed, stepping directly into my personal space. Her face flushed a blotchy red. "You have always owed me. I owe you what exactly?" "Everything," Brittany yelled, gesturing wildly. "Dad bought me a brand new Porsche for my 16th birthday, while you took the city bus in the freezing cold. You think I did not know you hated me for that? I was the one who went to the right private schools. I was the one who married the right man. I was the one who kept this family looking perfect in high society. You are supposed to support my lifestyle. You are supposed to be the invisible background character making me look good. It is my birthright to be the successful one." Her logic was so deeply rooted in toxic entitlement that I could not even formulate a response to her unhinged rant. Before I could tell her how delusional she sounded, a heavy hand slammed down hard on the table. Derek pushed past his hysterical wife and stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path. "Listen to me very carefully, Vanessa," Derek growled, lowering his voice to a rumble. "You are going to transfer those funds to my holding company first thing tomorrow morning. I have aggressive private investors threatening to tear my life apart, and I am not losing my commercial real estate firm just because you want to play a petty game of revenge. You have more money than you could ever spend. You are going to do the right thing and wire the 10 million. If you do not, I promise I will make your life an absolute living nightmare. I can ruin your startup reputation before the weekend is over." I did not back away. I tilted my chin up, maintaining steady eye contact with the man currently hemorrhaging money through his own sheer incompetence. "Your threats are as hollow as your business model, Derek," I said coldly, refusing to show an ounce of fear. "If you knew anything about my industry, you would know my professional reputation is bulletproof. You mismanaged your firm, made reckless offshore investments, and dug your own grave. I highly suggest you go find a shovel because you are not using my bank account to climb out." Derek's face turned a shade of purple with rage. He raised his hand slightly, his fingers twitching as if he might grab my shoulders and force me to comply with his demands. But before he could make physical contact, my father's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and dangerously calm. "Derek, step back," Thomas ordered. His voice lacked any familial warmth but carried absolute, unquestionable authority. Derek immediately retreated, falling into line behind the patriarch of the family. Thomas stopped a few feet away from me, folding his hands behind his back. "You are feeling very victorious right now, Vanessa," Thomas said, his tone completely devoid of the screaming rage he had displayed earlier in the evening. "You think you have outsmarted all of us. You think you can just walk away with $400 million and leave this family in the dust. But you seem to have forgotten a very important piece of your own history. I narrowed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever dark manipulation he was about to attempt. I have not forgotten anything, Thomas. Clearly you have, he replied, a dark, sinister smile spreading slowly across his weathered face. 12 years ago, you needed college credit for your degree. You came crawling to me, and I allowed you to do a brief summer internship at the corporate headquarters of Kensington Logistics. You worked in our data processing department for 3 months. And like every single employee who walks through my doors, you signed a standard employment contract on your very first day. My heart gave a slight uncomfortable thud against my ribs, but I kept my facial expression perfectly blank. It was a college internship filling out spreadsheets and organizing filing cabinets. It means absolutely nothing. It means everything. Thomas countered, stepping one pace closer, invading my space with his towering presence. That contract contained an ironclad non-disclosure and non-compete agreement. It explicitly states that any intellectual property algorithms or data systems developed by an employee using Kensington resources or foundational knowledge belong entirely to Kensington Logistics. You built your little artificial intelligence cybersecurity software using the foundational knowledge you gained under my roof. You stole from my company, Vanessa. I stared at him, utterly repulsed by the ease with which he fabricated such a massive, devastating lie. That is completely absurd, and you know it. I was 19 years old sorting shipping invoices for minimum wage. I built my proprietary algorithm a decade later entirely on my own time using my own equipment. You have absolutely no legal claim to my work or buyout. Thomas chuckled, a low sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The absolute truth does not matter in corporate litigation, Vanessa. What matters is who has the most aggressive lawyers and the deepest pockets to drag out the discovery phase. I am calling my legal team first thing tomorrow morning. I am filing an emergency injunction with the state court, and I am freezing every single one of your personal and business assets. Enjoy your money tonight because tomorrow it belongs to Kensington Logistics. I stared at him, letting the absurdity of his threat hang in the stifling air. I did not scream back. I simply picked up my coat, turned my back on the room, and walked out into the freezing Chicago night, leaving their shattered illusions behind. But my father was not a man who made idle threats, and he wasted no time executing his retaliation. The day after Christmas dawned gray and bitterly cold. Approaching my apartment building later that morning, I noticed 2 men in tailored charcoal suits standing right outside my door. One held a roll of packing tape while the other smoothed a stack of legal documents against the chipped wood. They looked entirely out of place, radiating corporate aggression. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I asked, keeping my tone mild. They turned sharply. The taller man stepped forward, his expression purely clinical. "Vanessa Kensington. You are being officially served on behalf of Kensington Logistics. This is a formal cease and desist order, along with notice of an emergency injunction filed this morning. We are initiating an immediate freeze on all your personal and business bank accounts." I unlocked my door, pushing it open. "On what grounds exactly?" The second lawyer adjusted his briefcase and repeated Thomas's theory in colder legal language. My 3-month college internship was now being twisted into the foundation for a claim against my entire algorithm. They advised me to secure counsel immediately. I took the taped document off my door, stepped inside, and shut it in their faces. I dropped the packet onto my kitchen counter, staring at it with absolute disgust. Thomas was actually trying to claim that a basic summer filing internship organizing outdated shipping manifests was the technological blueprint for a next-generation artificial intelligence protocol. It was legally laughable, a pure desperation move meant to tie up my funds in court until I ran out of money. He was trying to starve me into submission. Before I could even pour my coffee, my cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before hitting accept. "Vanessa, please tell me you are being reasonable about all this," Barbara said, her voice breathy and frantic. "Your father is absolutely beside himself. You embarrassed him in front of the whole family, and now he is on a warpath. He is attempting to steal $400 million from me, Barbara. I am not the one on a warpath. Do not use such ugly words, she pleaded, shifting into the victim role she played so flawlessly. He just feels disrespected. You know how he gets when someone undermines his authority? Vanessa, I am begging you to compromise. Surrender 50% of the buyout money to the company. Just give him half to save the family peace. Save the family peace. The phrase echoed in my ear, thick with decades of toxic history. I remembered the state science fair when I won first place, and Thomas threw a massive fit because he had missed a networking golf tournament to attend. Barbara had quietly thrown my trophy in the trash the next day, telling me it was better not to remind him of things that upset him. She always prioritized his fragile ego over my well-being. You are asking me to give up $200 million just to soothe his pride, I said, keeping my voice steady. You want me to buy his affection so you do not have to deal with his temper tantrums. I am asking you to be a good daughter, Barbara snapped, dropping the sweet maternal facade entirely. He provides for this family. Whenever you outshine him, it makes things impossible for me. Do you remember when you got that academic scholarship to Stanford and he threatened to cut us all off because he had not explicitly approved the application? I had to beg him for days to calm down. I have spent my entire life managing his moods to keep this family intact. You owe it to me to make this easy. Sign the settlement they bring you. Do not drag me into a drawn-out legal war just because you want to be stubborn. I let her finish her frantic justification. The manipulation was so deeply ingrained in her character that it did not even hurt anymore. She was an enabler who actively sacrificed my well-being to protect Thomas and ensure her own comfortable survival. Tell Thomas, I will meet him at his office at noon, I said. Have his lawyers present. I hung up the phone before she could launch into another guilt trip. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a very specific set of documents. When I walked into the sprawling glass and steel tower of Kensington Logistics, I was escorted immediately to the top floor. The executive boardroom was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Chicago skyline, and a massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Thomas sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 corporate attorneys. He looked incredibly smug, his posture relaxed, his hands steepled under his chin. He genuinely believed he had already won. He thought I was the same terrified 19-year-old girl who used to shrink under his booming voice, ready to surrender at the first sign of conflict. Take a seat, Vanessa, Thomas commanded, gesturing to the solitary chair positioned at the opposite end of the long table. Let us get straight to business. I am a generous man. I am willing to avoid a messy public trial that will drag your name through the mud and ruin your career. One of the lawyers slid a sleek black folder across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. That is a settlement agreement, Thomas continued, a victorious smirk playing on his lips. You sign over the intellectual property rights of your software to Kensington Logistics. In exchange, I will graciously allow you to keep $20 million as a consulting fee. You walk away wealthy, and my company takes its rightful ownership of the asset you built using our resources. It is a very fair deal. If you refuse, my team will ensure your bank accounts remain frozen until you cannot afford to buy groceries. I looked down at the black folder. I did not touch it. I did not open it. I simply reached into my own leather tote bag and pulled out a thick red folder. I placed my hand firmly on top of it and looked directly down the length of the table into my father's arrogant eyes. I am not signing your settlement, Thomas, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the boardroom. I slid the thick red folder across the mahogany table. It glided smoothly, coming to a halt perfectly centered in front of his steepled hands. Thomas frowned, looking down at the red folder, but refusing to touch it. What is this garbage, Vanessa? Sue me for the $400 million, Thomas, I said, leaning forward slightly. Bring your massive legal team. File your injunctions. Demand a full trial. But to do that, you have to enter the discovery phase. And during discovery, to prove my algorithm supposedly used your logistical data, my artificial intelligence software will legally have to audit your company's financial books. I paused, watching the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw as the lawyers beside him suddenly went perfectly still. Which is a problem for you? I continued, my tone completely merciless. Because when I ran a preliminary scan of Kensington Logistics' public routing data against standard offshore banking transfers to verify the strength of my software, it flagged something very interesting. It flagged 15 years of your aggressive offshore embezzlement. The lead attorney for Kensington Logistics slowly reached out and opened the red folder. The massive boardroom was so quiet I could hear the stiff paper creak. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the first page of the audit. Then he quickly flipped to the second page. By the third page, the color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He did not say a word to my father. He simply closed the folder, pushed his leather chair back, and began aggressively shoving his legal pads into his briefcase. The other two attorneys, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, leaned over to glance at the top sheet. Their physical reactions were identical. They began packing their bags with frantic urgency. Thomas looked at his legal team in utter confusion, his steepled fingers dropping heavily to the mahogany table. "What are you doing?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Sit back down and serve her the papers right now." The lead attorney snapped his briefcase shut with a loud click. "We are dropping the injunction, Thomas," he said, his voice stripped of professional courtesy. "Effective immediately. In fact, as of this exact moment, we are formally withdrawing as your legal counsel. I advise you to hire a criminal defense attorney today." Without another word, the three men marched out of the boardroom, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind them. Thomas sat completely paralyzed in the wake of their rapid departure. The reality of the situation had not fully registered yet. He slowly reached across the polished wood and pulled the red folder toward himself. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the pages. I sat perfectly still and watched the arrogant patriarch of the Kensington family disintegrate right before my eyes. The documents inside that folder detailed routing numbers, shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and hidden ledgers that undeniably proved he had been siphoning millions from his own company. My algorithm had easily tracked the discrepancies to avoid corporate taxes and hide his true net worth. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He tugged frantically at his silk tie, suddenly struggling to breathe in the expansive room. "Vanessa," he gasped, his voice reduced to a pathetic, reedy whisper that I had never heard from him before. "You cannot give this information to the federal authorities. They will dismantle the entire logistics company. I will go to federal prison for this. Please, you have to keep this quiet." I looked at the man who had publicly disinherited me and tried to steal my life's work just 24 hours ago. I searched myself for any lingering emotional attachment, but I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity and no anger left inside me, just a clinical detachment. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the long table to him. "That is an ironclad waiver," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "It completely relinquishes any and all claims you or Kensington Logistics might ever try to make against my intellectual property, my algorithms, or my $400 million buyout. You are going to sign it right now." Thomas stared at the paper, then back at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to process his total defeat. "And if I sign it, you destroy the audit right here," he pleaded, desperate for a lifeline. "No," I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. "If you sign it, I place a temporary 48-hour hold on sending that folder directly to the Internal Revenue Service. That gives you exactly 2 days to contact a defense attorney and prepare for the storm that is coming. If you do not sign it, the files transmit to the federal authorities the second I walk out of this building." He picked up his expensive fountain pen with a violently trembling hand. He did not bother to read the waiver. He just scrawled his signature across the bottom line, effectively signing away his fake leverage over my life. He pushed the paper back to me, looking like a broken, defeated old man. I calmly picked up the waiver, verified his signature, and tucked the document safely into my bag. I had just closed the zipper when the heavy boardroom doors violently burst open. Brittany marched into the room, flanked closely by Derek. They strolled in with their heads held high, completely oblivious to the catastrophic shift in power that had just occurred. They did not notice Thomas sweating and hyperventilating at the head of the table. They only saw me packing my bag and immediately assumed I had just been crushed by my father's corporate legal team. They believed Thomas had successfully bullied me into submission. "Well," Brittany announced, crossing her arms over her pristine cashmere coat. "I hope you finally learned your lesson, Vanessa. Mom told us you were up here throwing a massive tantrum about the money and refusing to help Derek. I hope Dad made you sign over every single penny to the company. It is exactly what you deserve for being so incredibly selfish and arrogant at Christmas dinner. Family helps family, and you tried to leave us with nothing when we needed you the most." Derek stepped up beside her wearing a smug, arrogant grin that made my stomach turn. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, rolling his shoulders back to make himself appear larger and more intimidating. "You really thought you could hold that money over our heads, did you not?" he sneered, stepping further into the room and invading my personal space. "You thought I would come crawling to you for a bailout just because my firm hit a minor rough patch in the market? You wanted me to get down on my knees and beg. Well, you vastly overestimated your own importance, Vanessa. I do not need a single cent of your little startup cash anyway." I paused, letting my hand rest on the strap of my bag. I looked at Derek, tilting my head slightly. "Is that right, Derek?" I asked, my voice calm. "You magically solved your $10 million liquidity crisis overnight without any outside help." "Absolutely," Derek boasted, puffing out his chest as he wrapped an arm around Brittany's waist. "I am a highly respected businessman in this city. I have actual tangible assets. I just secured a massive secondary mortgage on our estate. The funds are clearing by tomorrow morning, completely bypassing the need for your pathetic charity. We are entirely untouchable." I looked at Brittany, who was smiling triumphantly. I slowly pulled the strap of my bag over my shoulder, taking a deliberate step toward the exit. "A secondary mortgage?" I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Through Apex Financial, correct." Derek's smug smile faltered. "How do you know the exact name of my lender?" he demanded. I offered him a brilliant smile. I watched the blood drain from his face as the devastating realization finally hit him. The false reality he had carefully constructed to impress his wife was about to collapse. I forgot to mention, part of my buyout negotiations included giving me a majority shareholder seat at Apex Financial. "I legally own the institution holding your debt. I personally reviewed and approved your secondary loan this morning, Derek," I whispered. "And I know exactly what you actually used the estate collateral for." Derek's confident posture dissolved instantly. The blood rushed from his face, leaving him with a sickly, translucent pallor that mirrored the three corporate lawyers who had just fled the room. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The aggressive titan of commercial real estate was suddenly reduced to a terrified man standing in an oversized designer suit. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the leather chair behind him. Brittany looked back and forth between us, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawing together in a tight knot of genuine confusion. She reached out and grabbed her husband's arm, shaking it slightly. "What is she talking about, Derek?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "What does she mean she approved the loan? Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not put our estate up as collateral." Derek could not even look at her. He stared down at the floor, his breathing incredibly shallow and rapid. I kept my gaze fixed on him, letting the agonizing silence stretch out before I finally answered my sister. "He put the estate up as collateral, Brittany," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and conversational. "He submitted the application 3 days ago. It was immediately flagged for executive review because of the sheer size of the request and his increasingly terrible credit score. When I saw his name cross my desk, I authorized the approval myself. I wanted to see exactly how desperate he had become." Brittany let go of his arm, taking a defiant step toward me. She was desperately trying to maintain her fierce socialite facade, but the cracks were clearly showing. "So, what if he did?" she snapped, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "It is a highly strategic business move. He needs liquidity for his commercial properties. It is an investment. You are just jealous because you will never understand high-level finance." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. High-level finance is not what I would call it. I opened my bag again and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it slowly across the polished table. I did not bother looking at Thomas, who was still slumped in his chair, silently hyperventilating as his world collapsed. My entire focus was strictly on my sister and the devastating truth she was about to hear. Derek did not use that money to stabilize his commercial real estate firm, I said, delivering the words with clinical precision. In fact, he has not invested a single dime into his company in over 18 months. His investors are pulling out because the firm is a hollow shell. He used the secondary mortgage to secretly cover massive illegal offshore gambling debts. No, Brittany whispered, taking a sudden step back. No, you are absolutely lying. Derek is a professional. He is an addict, I corrected her coldly. He has been wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to unregulated sports betting syndicates based in the Caribbean. He lost over $2 million betting on European soccer leagues alone this past quarter. When his bookies started making credible threats against him, he panicked. He needed a massive influx of untraceable cash to pay them off before they came to your perfect little house in the suburbs. So he leveraged the only tangible asset he had left. He mortgaged the estate. Derek finally found his voice. "Shut up, Vanessa," he yelled, his voice cracking with utter desperation. "You have no right to look into my personal accounts. You have no right to speak to my wife about my business." "When you borrow money from my institution, your business becomes my business," I replied. "And you should be very concerned about your wife, Derek, because as you well know, her name is on the deed to that estate, which means you forged her signature on the loan documents to secure the capital." Brittany gasped, pressing her manicured hands tightly over her mouth. "That is right, Brittany," I said, holding her horrified gaze. "You are fully legally liable for a loan you never knew existed. If he defaults on the payments, the bank legally takes the house. And considering he just wired the entirety of the funds offshore to cover his losses, he has absolutely zero capital left to make the monthly installments. Your pristine suburban life is entirely leveraged against a gambling debt." I waited for the realization to wash over her completely. I waited for her to turn around and slap her deceitful husband across the face. I waited for her to scream at the man who had secretly gambled away their home and forged her name on federal banking documents. Instead, cognitive dissonance took the wheel. The human brain can only handle so much trauma before it completely rewrites reality to protect itself. Brittany could not accept that the man she had chosen, the man she had used to mock my single lifestyle for years, was a catastrophic failure. It was far easier to blame the sister she already hated. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered venom. She lunged forward, slamming her hands heavily on the table right next to the printed summary of Derek's offshore wires. "You did this to us!" Brittany screamed, spit flying from her lips. "You set a trap for him." I blinked, genuinely taken aback by the sheer absurdity of her accusation. "I set a trap. I did not force him to place illegal bets, Brittany. I did not force him to forge your signature." "You approved the loan!" she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "You knew exactly what he was doing, and you approved it anyway just to ruin my marriage. You have always been jealous of me, Vanessa. You have always hated that I had a beautiful home and a husband who truly provided for me. You sat in your miserable little apartment plotting against us. You approved that money out of pure spite so you could stand here today and watch my perfect life fall apart." Her logic was so twisted, so completely divorced from reality, that I felt a brief flash of genuine pity for her. She was so desperate to preserve her illusion of superiority that she was actively defending the man who had just financially ruined her. "I did not make him gamble, Brittany," I said slowly, enunciating every single word. "I gave him the rope. He chose to hang himself with it." Before Brittany could launch into another tirade, the boardroom doors swung completely open. Barbara hurried inside, clutching her designer handbag. She saw Thomas sweating profusely and her precious Brittany crying. "What exactly have you done to your sister?" Barbara demanded, rushing over to safely wrap her arms around Brittany. "She ruined us." "Mom," Brittany sobbed uncontrollably. She maliciously approved a loan for Derek just to trap us and purposefully lose our house. Barbara did not ask any logical details, instantly siding with Brittany. I completely demand that you pay off that mortgage immediately to save her marriage, she ordered. I slowly packed my bag. I am not paying, I said. The first payment is due on January 1st, or I will surely initiate immediate foreclosure. Barbara's face twisted into pure malice. If you foreclose on your sister, I will stand up at the New Year's Eve gala tomorrow and tell the entire city the truth about who your real father is. You will be a massive laughingstock. The echo of my mother's screaming threat bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom. I stood completely still, holding the strap of my leather tote bag. The sheer magnitude of her desperation hung in the stale air. For 33 years, I had chased this woman's approval. I had twisted myself into knots, trying to be the perfect daughter, hoping that one day she would look at me with the same adoration she showered effortlessly onto Brittany. I had internalized every cruel comment, every lingering sigh of disappointment, and every subtle rejection. I had always believed there was something fundamentally unlovable about me. Now she was weaponizing my very existence just to shield a son-in-law who had gambled away his home. Barbara stepped around the massive mahogany table, her eyes wide and manic. She saw my silence as hesitation. She thought she had found the ultimate leverage to break my newly discovered power. She raised her chin, looking down her nose at me with a practiced sneer of superiority. "That is right, Vanessa," Barbara hissed, taking another step closer. "If you do not wipe out Derek's debt right now, I will go to the press. The media loves a good scandal about a newly minted billionaire. I will stand in front of every camera at the charity gala tomorrow night and tell the world that you are the product of a cheap, illicit affair. I will tell them you do not even carry Kensington blood. You will be a spectacular laughingstock. Your pristine corporate reputation will be dragged through the mud before the new year even begins." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of spite. Thomas was still slumped in his chair, silently hyperventilating from his own impending federal ruin. Brittany was clinging to Derek, staring at our mother with a mixture of shock and opportunistic glee. "You always wondered why we left you at home during the family trips to Europe?" Barbara continued, her voice dripping with venom. "Because you were a mistake I could not bear to look at. You were a walking, breathing reminder of a terrible lapse in judgment. I tolerated you in my house because I had to, but you were never truly part of this family. You never belonged with us, so do not think for one second that you hold any power here. You are nothing but an embarrassing accident. Pay off the house, Vanessa. Do it or I ruin you." She crossed her arms, waiting for the devastation to hit me. She was expecting tears. She was expecting the terrified little girl who used to cry alone in her bedroom when the family cars pulled out of the driveway for the airport. She wanted me to fall to my knees and beg her to keep the secret. Instead, a strange, incredibly warm sensation began to spread through my chest. It started as a tiny spark and quickly blossomed into a wave of profound, absolute liberation. The heavy, invisible chains that had anchored me to this toxic family for over 3 decades simply snapped. The desperate gnawing hunger for my mother's love, the constant seeking of her validation, it all vanished into thin air. I looked at her and felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. She was not a mother protecting her child. She was just a cornered, desperate woman telling a vicious, fabricated story to maintain her fragile grip on a crumbling empire. I knew my biology. I had seen my own medical records. I knew the physical traits I shared with the man currently sweating through his designer suit at the end of the table. Barbara was lying. She was throwing out the most damaging, horrific lie she could invent, hoping the sheer shock value would force my compliance. It was a pathetic, desperate bluff. "Are you quite finished, Barbara?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotional weight. Her confident sneer faltered slightly. She uncrossed her arms, thrown off by my complete lack of a breakdown. "I said I will ruin you, Vanessa," she repeated, her voice pitching up in volume. You are going to ruin me by publicly admitting to high society that you were unfaithful to your billionaire husband, I replied, letting a small cold smile touch my lips. You are going to stand at the most exclusive social event of the year and announce that you committed adultery. You think the media will laugh at me. They will absolutely devour you. You will be permanently exiled from every country club, charity board, and social circle in Chicago. But please be my guest. Go to the press. Tell them whatever fairy tale you think will save Derek from his own staggering stupidity. I turned away from her and looked at Thomas. He had finally stopped hyperventilating, but he was staring at his wife in sheer horror. The fallout of her screaming confession, even a fake one, was clearly making his chest tighten all over again. 48 hours. Thomas Vi reminded him, letting my gaze drift to the red folder sitting near his trembling hands. You better start making some phone calls. The clock is already ticking. I adjusted the strap of my tote bag and turned my back on the entire room. I did not look at Brittany. I did not look at Derek. I walked toward the heavy wooden doors, my footsteps echoing loudly against the polished floor. Just as I reached the exit, I noticed the half-empty ceramic coffee cup sitting on the small side table near the door. Barbara had brought it in with her when she burst into the boardroom, leaving it there when she rushed to console Brittany. The rim was heavily stained with her signature bright red lipstick. Without breaking my stride, I picked up the ceramic cup by the very bottom edge, holding it carefully to preserve the rim. I pushed the heavy doors open with my shoulder and walked out into the executive hallway, leaving my former family trapped in the chaotic destruction of their own making. I took the private elevator down to the lobby, my mind operating with total, absolute clarity. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel grief. I felt an exhilarating sense of power. The world was entirely mine now, and I was no longer playing by their rules. When I stepped out of the glass building into the freezing winter air, my personal driver was waiting by the curb. I slid into the warm leather back seat of the luxury sedan and immediately pulled my cell phone from my bag. I dialed the direct number for the lead investigator on my personal legal team. He answered on the first ring. I need you to meet me at the downtown secure lab in 15 minutes, I instructed, looking down at the red lipstick stained across the white ceramic rim. I have a biological sample that requires an expedited discrete DNA test. I need it run against my own genetic profile. I want the certified legal results in my hands by tomorrow afternoon. Money is not an object. Pay whatever priority fees are necessary. Understood, Ms. Kensington? The investigator replied smoothly. I will have the lab director waiting for you. I opened my personal messaging app. I sent my mother one final text. See you at the gala. Make sure you wear waterproof mascara. The grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club was a spectacle of winter opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables draped in white silk, adorned with towering arrangements of orchids and silver birch branches. The New Year's Eve charity gala was the most exclusive social event in Chicago, where the city's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth and secure their status. I stood outside the main doors, watching the arrivals through the tinted windows of my idling car. Inside, the Kensington family was holding court near the center of the room. Thomas wore a bespoke tuxedo, aggressively swirling a glass of scotch while forcing a hearty laugh at a joke told by an alderman. Barbara stood rigidly at his side, draped in emerald satin and dripping in diamonds, her smile brittle and strained. Brittany and Derek were a few feet away, putting on a spectacular performance of marital bliss. Derek had his arm wrapped tightly around Brittany's waist, pulling her close for the society photographers while she leaned into his shoulder with a practiced, radiant smile. To the rest of the room, they were the picture of multi-generational success and unshakable power. Only I knew that underneath the tailored suits and designer gowns, they were terrified, suffocating under the weight of their imminent financial collapse. They were desperately projecting their usual facade of wealth, hoping that if they just smiled wide enough, the impending doom would somehow magically disappear. I waited until the lobby was packed with local media before giving my driver the signal. The black Maybach rolled up to the red carpet. The moment my chauffeur opened the door, and I stepped out into the freezing night air, the atmosphere outside the club shifted violently. The press corps, who had been lazily snapping photos of local politicians, suddenly surged forward like a tidal wave. Camera flashes erupted in a blinding strobe effect illuminating the winter night. I wore a custom floor-length gown of deep midnight blue silk, designed with sharp architectural lines that projected total authority. I did not look like the discarded rebellious daughter of Thomas Kensington. I looked exactly like what I was, a newly minted tech titan who had just closed a $400 million buyout. Reporters shouted questions over each other, asking about the future of my algorithm, my sudden leap into the billionaire class, and my upcoming philanthropic ventures. I smiled politely, offering brief, gracious answers as my security detail carved a path through the throng of journalists. The commotion outside was so loud that the heavy brass doors of the club were opened by staff to see what was happening. As I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, the overwhelming noise from the press followed me inside, causing dozens of heads to turn in my direction. Thomas and Barbara immediately noticed the disruption. When they saw me standing at the center of the media frenzy, their carefully constructed expressions of aristocratic boredom morphed into genuine panic. They exchanged a frantic look before abandoning their conversation. They marched purposefully toward the entrance, slicing through the crowd with angry, determined strides. They intercepted me just as I reached the edge of the main ballroom, effectively blocking my path. Barbara moved in close, lowering her voice to a venomous hiss so the nearby reporters would not hear. "What do you think you are doing showing up here?" she demanded, her eyes darting nervously toward the cameras. "You are not welcome at this club, Vanessa. We did not invite you to sit at our table." Thomas stepped up right beside her, puffing out his chest to physically intimidate me. "You need to turn around and leave right now," he ordered, his voice thick with suppressed rage. "I am on the board of directors for this country club. I will have security physically drag you out into the snow if you take one more step into this room." I looked at the two of them, utterly unfazed by their hollow authority. I did not need to say a single word, because the event's head organizer, a frantic woman with a clipboard and an earpiece, was already sprinting across the foyer toward us. Thomas turned to her, pointing an angry finger at me. "Get security over here immediately," Thomas commanded. "This woman is trespassing and causing a massive disruption." The organizer looked at Thomas in absolute horror. "Mr. Kensington, please step aside," she gasped, practically shoving herself between us to shield me from my father. "This woman is not trespassing. Miss Kensington is our anonymous VIP sponsor. She personally funded the entirety of tonight's gala, including the catering, the venue, and the charity endowment. She is our guest of honor." Thomas's arm dropped to his side as if the bones had suddenly dissolved. The blood rushed from his face, leaving him looking sickly and old. Barbara stared at the organizer, her jaw falling open in complete disbelief. The power dynamic of the entire room shifted in a single heartbeat. The organizers and security staff gently but firmly brushed my parents aside, clearing a wide, respectful path for me to enter the ballroom. I spent the hour mingling with powerful figures, accepting congratulations, and discussing investments. I could feel Barbara's eyes burning into my back the entire time. She was tracking my movement, pacing the edge of the dance floor like a caged predator. Finally, when I excused myself to get a glass of sparkling water, she saw her opening. She cornered me near a massive carved ice sculpture in a secluded alcove near the terrace doors. The air around the swan was biting, but it was nothing compared to the chill radiating from my mother. She stepped into my personal space, dropping the aristocratic pretense. "I warned you yesterday," Barbara whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You had one chance to save Brittany's house quietly, and you chose to humiliate this family instead." I took a calm sip of sparkling water, watching her unravel behind the diamonds and emerald satin. "You still think money makes you untouchable?" she hissed. "It does not. One word from me, one sentence into that microphone, and every person in this ballroom will stop seeing you as a brilliant new billionaire and start seeing you as the dirty little secret this family was forced to tolerate." I set my glass down without flinching. Barbara leaned closer, mistaking my silence for fear. "Call the bank. Clear Derek's mortgage. Do it now, Vanessa, or I go straight to the stage. I reached into my bag and handed her a sleek black envelope. Go to the microphone, Barbara, I said calmly, but you might want to open this first. I did not flinch. I reached into my bag and handed Barbara a sleek black envelope. Go to the microphone, Barbara, I calmly said, my voice echoing with absolute chilling finality. But you might want to open this envelope first and see exactly what it is. Barbara stared at the heavy black cardstock in my outstretched hand. The ambient noise of the charity gala seemed to fade into a dull, rushing roar around us. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the soft jazz playing from the main stage, and the arrogant chatter of Chicago's elite all melted away. The extravagant wealth of the ballroom, the towering centerpieces and the sparkling chandeliers felt entirely disconnected from the dark, freezing reality unfolding in this secluded corner. She narrowed her heavily lined eyes aggressively, looking for the traps, searching my face for any sign of weakness, fear, or a desperate bluff. Finding absolutely none, she snatched the sleek envelope from my fingers with a sharp, vicious tug. The thick paper resisted for a fraction of a second before slipping into her grasp. She broke the wax seal with her manicured thumbnail, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of her own venomous threats. She pulled out the folded documents inside. The heavy embossed seal of the downtown secure genetic laboratory gleamed in the dim light of the alcove. I stood perfectly still, letting the biting chill of the carved ice swan beside us radiate against my bare shoulders, waiting for the truth to shatter her. Barbara unfolded the thick paper with jerky, impatient movements. Her eyes darted across the official letterhead, scanning the legal certifications and the expedited processing stamps from the lab director I had just paid handsomely. Then she reached the core data. I watched her perfectly painted lips part in silent confusion as she read the genetic markers. The document explicitly detailed a 99.9% probability of paternity between Thomas Kensington and myself. It was an ironclad, legally certified confirmation that I was without a shadow of a doubt his biological daughter. Her entire blackmail strategy, her ultimate weapon to publicly humiliate me and force me to erase Derek's catastrophic gambling debt, evaporated into thin air. She read the conclusion again, her brow furrowing deeply. She let out a sharp, derisive scoff, attempting to mask her profound failure with manufactured outrage. You really thought this pathetic trick would stop me, she whispered, her voice laced with desperate malice. You went out and bought a fake DNA test to save your pristine new reputation. You think a fabricated piece of paper changes anything I am about to do tonight. I will still walk right up to that microphone and tell everyone the truth. I will tell them exactly what kind of illegitimate mistake you truly are. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact or show any intimidation. I simply tilted my head toward the documents in her hand. Turn to the second page, Barbara, I instructed, keeping my tone as cold and unyielding as the sculpted ice beside us. Read the second page before you run off to make your grand announcement to the press. Barbara glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation, but her eyes flicked downward. She flipped the first heavy sheet over. As her gaze landed on the second document, the air completely left her lungs. Her physical reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The defiant aristocratic sneer vanished from her face. The blood drained from her cheeks with such terrifying speed that her skin took on the waxy, translucent pallor of a corpse. Her mouth opened, but the harsh, vindictive words she had prepared died in her throat, replaced by a hollow, breathless gasp. The expensive paper in her hand began to tremble violently. The second page was not from the expedited test I had run yesterday. It was a certified medical document I had kept locked away securely for nearly 6 years. It was a comprehensive genetic analysis I had ordered when I was initially designing the predictive health algorithms for my early tech ventures. To build accurate data models, I needed a complete family medical history. I had discreetly acquired DNA samples from everyone in the household to map our genetic predispositions. I was simply looking for hereditary markers to build my software. I was not looking for dark family secrets. But the data did not care about family secrets. The algorithm had highlighted a massive, glaring biological impossibility. The second page Barbara was now holding proved with absolute scientific certainty that her precious, beloved golden child did not share a single strand of paternal DNA with Thomas Kensington. Brittany was the illegitimate child. Brittany was the product of a cheap, illicit affair. Brittany was the actual bastard she had just threatened to expose to the world. "You thought I did not know," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. "You thought you could carry that filthy lie to the grave." I watched the horrifying realization wash over her completely. Every interaction we ever had, every miserable moment of my childhood suddenly crystallized into perfect, agonizing clarity. The relentless abuse, the constant crushing criticism, the way she had always looked at me with such profound, unexplainable distaste. It had never been about me. It was never about my clothes or my grades or my social awkwardness. It was pure, unadulterated projection. I was Thomas's actual daughter. I was the living, breathing proof of her marriage. She could not stand to look at me because I constantly reminded her of the vows she had broken. She had worshipped Brittany, showering her with endless affection, expensive gifts, and unearned praise, desperately overcompensating to hide her own monumental guilt. She had built a golden shrine around the child of her secret lover, while actively destroying the child of her husband, all to convince herself and the rest of the world that her perfect life was real. "You hated me because I was the truth," I told her, stepping marginally closer. "And you worshipped her because she was your lie." Barbara could not speak. The heavy diamond necklace at her throat trembled rapidly with every shallow, panicked breath she took. Her knuckles were turning stark white as she gripped the documents, practically crushing the expensive paper between her fingers. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like true madness. The threat of public exposure that she had so eagerly wielded against me was now wrapped like a tight noose around her own neck. She realized in that exact moment that if she stepped up to the microphone, if she invited the press to look into our family genetics, she would be the one destroyed. Thomas would file for divorce immediately. Her elite social standing would evaporate overnight. She would be left with absolutely nothing but a ruined reputation and a daughter married to a bankrupt gambling addict. The total destruction she had planned for me had violently reversed course and was now barreling directly toward her. Before she could even attempt to form a coherent sentence, heavy footsteps approached from behind me. Thomas had seen Barbara corner me by the ice sculpture. He had seen the intense exchange and his wife's sudden catastrophic physical reaction. He stepped into the secluded alcove, his jaw set in a hard, angry line, completely oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated. "What is going on over here?" he demanded, looking back and forth between us with deep suspicion. Barbara let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. She tried to crumple the papers, tried desperately to shove them back into the black envelope to hide her devastating secret from him. But she was far too slow, and her hands were shaking too violently to manage the simple task. Thomas saw the sheer, unadulterated panic in her eyes and the official laboratory seals on the documents she was frantically trying to conceal. His gaze locked onto the papers like a heat-seeking missile. Without a single word, he reached out and violently snatched the documents directly from Barbara's trembling hands. Thomas held the thick pages up to the dim light of the chandelier, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the heavy black text. I watched his gaze track across the first page the official seals, the genetic markers, and the undeniable conclusion of my paternity. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his features. He could not understand why Barbara was terrified by a document confirming what he already believed true. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but his eyes dropped to the second sheet of paper in his hands. The silence that stretched between the three of us became heavy and suffocating. Thomas read the second page once. He read it a second time, bringing the paper closer to his face, as if the lighting was playing tricks on his vision. He read the medical terminology, the statistical probabilities, and the stark clinical declaration that Brittany shared zero paternal DNA with him. The crisp white paper rattled in his grip. The rhythmic tempo of the jazz band playing in the main ballroom faded into a dull hum. Barbara let out another pathetic, strangled sound. She reached out with a shaking diamond-covered hand trying to touch him. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice cracking with terror. "Thomas, please, you have to let me explain." He violently ripped his arm away as if she were made of burning acid. He kept his eyes locked on the paper, his lips moving silently as he digested the magnitude of the betrayal. I stood perfectly still and watched the domineering patriarch of the Kensington family shatter into a million jagged pieces. I could practically see the memories flashing through his mind, recontextualizing his entire existence. For 33 years, he poured every ounce of his affection, his resources, and his fatherly pride into Brittany. He had bought her horses, funded her lavish European vacations, paid for her extravagant wedding, and repeatedly bailed out her deceitful, arrogant husband. He had groomed Brittany to be the shining star of the Kensington legacy, believing with every fiber of his being that she was his creation. And all the while he had alienated me. He starved me of affection, mocked my ambitions, and constantly reminded me that I was a poor, pathetic excuse for a daughter. He had publicly disinherited me and tried to steal my life's work just 48 hours ago. Yet as he stared at the laboratory results, the crushing irony hit him like a runaway freight train. I was his only true heir. I was the only one who actually shared his blood. I was the only one who inherited his ruthless business acumen, his drive, and his capacity to build an empire from the ground up. The child he had treated like absolute garbage had just orchestrated a $400 million buyout, while the child he worshipped was a biological stranger married to a bankrupt gambling addict. A low, guttural noise rumbled deep in his chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish and explosive rage. He slowly lowered the papers, finally turning his gaze to his wife of 35 years. The emerald satin of Barbara's gown seemed to swallow her whole as she shrank under his terrifying glare. She took a stumbling step backward, her back pressing against the cold, wet base of the carved ice swan. The frosty condensation soaked right through her expensive dress, but she did not seem to notice. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer hatred radiating from her husband. "Who?" Thomas demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper that carried effortlessly over the ambient noise of the gala. "Who was it, Barbara?" "Thomas. Please, it was decades ago," she sobbed, tears finally spilling over her waterproof mascara and cutting dark tracks down her heavily powdered cheeks. "It meant absolutely nothing. We were going through a rough patch and you were always working. You were never home. It was just a stupid mistake." "A mistake," Thomas roared, the volume of his voice suddenly shattering the polite decorum of the alcove. Several couples lingering near the terrace doors jumped in shock, their champagne flutes pausing mid-air as they turned to stare at the unfolding spectacle. Thomas did not care who was watching. The rigid image-obsessed facade he had maintained for decades evaporated in an instant. "You lied to me for 33 years, he screamed, stepping toward her with the crumpled DNA results clenched in his raised fist. "You made me raise another man's child. You made me pay for her entire life. You made me hand over my hard-earned money to that pathetic excuse of a son-in-law. You let me believe she was my legacy while you secretly mocked me behind my back. You disgusting, deceitful parasite." Barbara covered her face with her hands, weeping loudly and hysterically. "It was not like that," she wailed, trying to hide from the piercing stares of the country club elite, who were now openly pointing and whispering. "I loved you, Thomas. I stayed with you. I built this family with you. You built a parasitic lie." Thomas spat, his face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. "Every single thing you have ever done was a calculated manipulation to protect your filthy secret. You abused Vanessa just to throw me off the scent. You treated my actual biological daughter like a strayed dog just to overcompensate for your own monumental guilt. You disgust me, Barbara. I am completely done with you. As of this exact second, I am completely done. I am freezing every joint account. I am calling my lawyers right now. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." You will be out on the street by morning." Barbara let out a horrific, ear-piercing shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, begging and pleading with him to stop, to keep his voice down, to remember where they were. Thomas grabbed her wrists and shoved her backward with such force that she stumbled and fell hard onto the polished marble floor. Her emerald gown pooled around her in a tragic wet heap at the base of the melting ice sculpture. She lay there sobbing, a completely broken and ruined woman exposed for all of Chicago high society to see. Thomas stood over her for a long, heavy moment, his chest heaving as he stared down at the wreckage of his marriage. The reality of his situation was closing in from all sides. His golden child was a biological fraud. His wife was a deceitful traitor. His entire empire was burning down in public fashion. He had no leverage left, no allies, and no way out. Slowly, the violent rage contorting his features began to shift. The fiery anger drained away, replaced by calculating desperation. He turned away from his weeping wife and locked his eyes onto me. I had not moved a single inch. I stood with perfect clinical posture, watching the man who tormented me my entire life realize I was his only salvation. He took a step toward me, his breathing ragged, smoothing the rumpled lapels of his tuxedo with trembling hands. His eyes were wide with a frantic, sickening mixture of profound regret and undeniable greed. "Vanessa," he gasped, his voice taking on a pathetic, pleading tone. "Vanessa, you are my real daughter. We can fix this. We can combine your 400 million with Kensington Logistics. We can cut them out completely." I stared at the man standing before me. Thomas Kensington, the patriarch who had spent my life grinding my self-worth into dust, was looking at me as if I were his savior. His chest rose and fell rapidly beneath his pristine tuxedo shirt. The sheer audacity of his proposal hung in the freezing air of the alcove, mingling with the sounds of Barbara sobbing on the floor behind him. He was completely serious. In 60 seconds, he had discovered his wife was a lifelong traitor and his beloved golden child was a biological stranger. His immediate response was not to mourn, but to pivot to a business transaction. He was ready to throw the people he worshipped directly to the wolves as long as it saved his financial skin. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping just inches from my arm, as if remembering he had no right to touch me. His eyes were glassy, with a frantic mixture of desperation and predatory greed. He was calculating the synergy of my $400 million capital merged with his failing supply chain empire. He genuinely believed a shared bloodline and a massive pile of cash could instantly erase a lifetime of systematic abuse. He believed money could buy my loyalty, just as it had bought Barbara's silence and Derek's obedience. I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice in anger or lash out at his repulsive offer. Instead, a profound, chilling calm washed over my entire body. The years of desperate longing for his approval simply evaporated into the cold, ambient air of the ballroom foyer. There was nothing left but absolute clinical detachment. I looked at his outstretched hand, then slowly raised my gaze to meet his pleading eyes. I shook my head, the movement so slight it barely registered. My voice, when I finally spoke, was perfectly level and utterly devoid of warmth. "Combine my money with your company, Thomas." The sound of his given name made him flinch. He blinked rapidly, struggling to process my absolute lack of enthusiasm. "Yes," he urged, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Think about the market dominance we could achieve. With your capital injection, we can crush the competition. We can restructure the entire board tomorrow morning. I will make you a full partner. I will give you the executive corner office. We do not need Barbara. We do not need Brittany or that pathetic husband of hers. It is just you and me now, Vanessa, the real Kensington legacy." He was practically vibrating with the vision of his restructured empire, completely blind to the trap that had already snapped shut around his ankles. I took a slow, deliberate sip of sparkling water, letting the cold liquid soothe my throat before I delivered the final blow. "Did your corporate lawyers not tell you what happened this afternoon?" I asked, my tone conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than the destruction of his life. Thomas froze. The greedy light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a creeping shadow of confusion. He lowered his outstretched hand, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, the whisper turning into a defensive bark. "My lawyers have been preparing for this gala all day. They are handling the standard holiday tax filings. What happened this afternoon?" I smiled, a thin expression that offered no comfort. "You were so busy forcing Brittany and Derek to pose for photographers that you missed the shift in the market," I explained, stepping closer so he could hear every syllable. "When your legal team abruptly dropped the frivolous lawsuit against my algorithm yesterday morning, they did it to avoid a mandatory IRS audit. You knew an audit would expose the fraudulent loans you took out to cover Derek's gambling debts. You thought dropping the suit was a brilliant retreat to save your own skin." Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his silk bow tie. His eyes darted toward the ballroom, then back to me, the confusion rapidly evolving into genuine terror. He opened his mouth to defend his legal strategy, but the words died in his throat. "But your retreat sent a massive red flag directly to your creditors," I continued, my voice relentless. "You exposed your underbelly, Thomas. Dropping a multi-million-dollar lawsuit without a single concession signaled to the financial sector that Kensington Logistics was bleeding cash. It proved you were over-leveraged and out of viable options." Barbara's sobbing had quieted to a pathetic whimpering. She pushed herself up against the base of the ice sculpture, the emerald satin of her gown ruined by the melting water. But neither Thomas nor I looked at her. He was entirely captivated by the horrific picture I was painting. So I elaborated, keeping my tone detached. "While you were getting your tuxedo fitted and screaming at the club organizers, my acquisition conglomerate went to work. I did not just sell my algorithm to the highest bidder yesterday, Thomas. I formed a holding company with my new partners. And the very first thing my conglomerate did this afternoon was approach the primary lenders holding the toxic debt for Kensington Logistics." Thomas staggered backward as if physically struck in the chest. His black dress shoes scraped loudly against the marble floor. He reached out and grabbed the edge of a nearby cocktail table to steady himself, gripping the white tablecloth. "No," he gasped, his voice thin. "They would not sell. They are bound by institutional contracts. They require a mandatory 60-day notice for any transfer of corporate debt." "They were absolutely thrilled to sell," I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the raw panic washing over his aristocratic features. "Your company is sinking fast. Your credit rating is plummeting. They knew you were going to default on the next payment. When my holding company offered to buy your corporate debt at a premium, assuming all the immediate risk, they bypassed the 60-day notice by invoking the emergency distressed asset clause. The ink on the transfer documents dried 3 hours before you even walked through the doors of this country club." The air in the alcove felt as though it had been entirely siphoned away. Thomas stared at me, his face devoid of all color, his lips moving soundlessly as his brain tried to calculate the catastrophic magnitude of his reality. He had spent his entire life wielding money and power to control everyone around him. He had used his wealth to manipulate and destroy anyone who dared to step out of line. Now the very tools he worshipped had been masterfully turned against him by the daughter he threw away. "You bought my debt," he whispered, the words scraping painfully out of his throat. He looked at me not as a father looking at a child, but as a defeated general staring at the architect of his annihilation. "You own the paper on Kensington Logistics." I took one final measured step closer to him. The distance between us was now close enough that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to smell the expensive scotch on his breath, masking the scent of pure fear. I looked directly into his eyes, holding his gaze with absolute unyielding dominance. "I do not need to combine with your company, Thomas," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. "I am foreclosing on it. As of midnight tonight, Kensington Logistics belongs to me." Thomas stared at me. His jaw worked silently as his mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his defeat. The words hung between us, chilling the air far more effectively than the ice sculpture at Barbara's side. I watched the realization seep into his bones. His posture, usually rigid with manufactured authority, crumpled completely. The broad shoulders that had carried the weight of the Kensington legacy for decades slumped forward in total surrender. Behind him, the grand ballroom continued its lavish celebration. The jazz band transitioned into an upbeat, lively tempo, signaling that the new year was rapidly approaching. Laughter and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes echoed through the massive foyer, offering a stark contrast to the absolute devastation occurring in our secluded alcove. Thomas took a shaky breath. He glanced back at Barbara, who was still weeping softly on the damp marble floor, before returning his focus to me. The predatory greed that had lit up his eyes just moments ago vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. He realized I was not bluffing. He realized I held the executed contracts, the financial leverage, and the absolute power to completely dismantle his entire social identity. "Vanessa, you cannot do this!" he stammered, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot simply wipe out a century of family history. Kensington Logistics is my life. It is my father's legacy. It is everything I have ever built." I crossed my arms, feeling the cool silk of my gown against my skin. "You stopped building a long time ago, Thomas," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of sympathy. "You spent the last decade using the company as a personal piggy bank to fund Brittany's lifestyle and Derek's catastrophic failures. You hollowed out your own legacy. I simply bought the empty shell." He stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. The arrogance was completely gone, stripped away by the terrifying prospect of public ruin. "We can negotiate this," he pleaded, his eyes darting frantically as he searched for a lifeline. "You want the company? Fine, you have it. I will step down as Chief Executive Officer tomorrow morning. I will draft the press release myself. I will tell the board, the shareholders, the media, everyone. I will say I am retiring to focus on philanthropic endeavors and passing the torch to you." He was bargaining now, desperately trying to salvage whatever microscopic shred of dignity he had left. He did not care about the company anymore. He only cared about how his failure would look to the wealthy elite laughing and drinking in the next room. "Just leave me a seat on the board," he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, strained whisper. "Make me a minority shareholder, a silent partner. Give me a title, Vanessa. Anything. Just a title so I can walk into this country club next week and hold my head up. Let me keep my dignity. Please, we are blood. We can make this a seamless transition. The press will eat it up. A triumphant family succession. No one ever has to know about the debt or the foreclosure." I looked at the man who had spent 33 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the father who had weaponized his affection, wielding it to control, manipulate, and punish. I thought about the decades of subtle cruelties, the outright rejections, and the profound, aching loneliness of growing up in a house where I was treated like an unwanted guest. I felt absolutely nothing. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to hold my gaze. "I do not want a seamless transition, Thomas," I stated calmly. "I want a hostile takeover. I want the entire financial sector of Chicago to know exactly how badly you mismanaged your father's empire. I want them to see the rusted, rotting core of the Kensington legacy." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "Do you remember Christmas dinner?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational but sharp. "Do you remember standing at the head of the table? You wore your favorite navy blue sweater. You looked down at me as if I were a piece of dirt on your expensive rug." He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a slow path down his temple. "You handed me that revised will in front of the entire extended family." I continued enunciating every single word so he could not escape the memory. "You proudly announced that Brittany would receive everything because she was the perfect daughter who knew how to play the game. You looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was cut out. You said you were doing me a favor. You told me I needed to learn independence." Barbara let out a fresh sob from the floor, the sound echoing weakly against the cold stone walls. Thomas closed his eyes, his face twisting in an agonizing grimace of profound regret. "Well, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper, "consider this your first lesson in independence. You are completely on your own." As the words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted dramatically. The band abruptly stopped playing, replaced by the booming, charismatic voice. The master of ceremonies echoed through the massive speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer roared, his voice filled with festive excitement. "Please gather your glasses and find your loved ones. We are 60 seconds away from midnight. Let us count down to a brand new year." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic cheers. The sound of hundreds of people shuffling toward the center of the room, preparing for the celebratory balloon drop, filled the air. Thomas turned his head slowly toward the ballroom doors, his expression vacant and horrified. The countdown was not just marking the end of the year. It was marking the exact moment his empire officially collapsed. He looked back at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears of utter defeat. "Vanessa." He choked out, his voice barely audible over the rising noise of the party. "You are destroying us. You destroyed yourselves," I replied coldly. "I just stopped paying the cleanup bill." 10. The crowd shouted in unison, their voices echoing through the luxurious country club. Barbara finally managed to push herself up into a sitting position. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her carefully styled hair plastered to her wet face. She looked like a ruined, pathetic ghost. 9. 8. Thomas stared at the floor, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The reality of his complete financial and social destruction was finally setting in. Tomorrow morning, the business journals would run the story. His country club memberships would be revoked. His credit lines would be frozen. He would be an outcast in the very society he had dedicated his entire life to impressing. 7. 6. I checked my watch. The digital face glowed brightly in the dim light of the alcove. The execution of the foreclosure was automated. It was tied directly to the servers at my holding company. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! The large crowd roared loudly. Suddenly, Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stared at the glowing screen, completely horrified. It was the automated alert from Apex Financial. The new year had struck, the grace period was over, and the foreclosure process on his and Brittany's estate was officially initiated. Derek's hands shook so violently that the expensive smartphone nearly slipped from his grasp, clattering against his gold cufflinks. The bright screen reflected against his pale, sweaty face, casting a sickly, artificial glow over his terrified features. Brittany, who had been lingering near the edge of the alcove, trying to figure out exactly why her parents were huddled in a tense, hushed circle with me, noticed her husband's sudden, inexplicable paralysis. She marched over her designer heels, clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, her face arranged in an expression of intense, aristocratic annoyance. She snatched the phone right out of his trembling fingers before he could even attempt to hide the screen or offer a pathetic excuse. I watched her perfectly manicured nails grip the device tightly as her eyes scanned the automated text message. It took only a few seconds for her brain to process the stark, unforgiving language of Apex Financial. Foreclosure initiated. Seizure of assets pending. Immediate eviction proceedings scheduled. The flawless, radiant smile she had been flashing at the society photographers all evening completely dissolved, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked up at Derek, her mouth opening and closing, as if all the freezing winter air had been violently sucked out of the room. Her carefully curated reality, built entirely on my father's stolen money, and her husband's endless deceit, was crumbling into dust right in front of her very eyes. The absolute destruction of her pampered life had finally arrived. "Are you kidding me?" Brittany shrieked, the sheer volume of her voice tearing through the ambient, polite chatter of the ballroom. The joyous celebration of the new year instantly ground to a halt. Hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest citizens turned their heads toward the alcove in absolute disbelief, their crystal champagne flutes frozen midair. "You promised me you handled this," she screamed, stepping toward him and shoving the phone incredibly hard into his chest. "You told me the debts were cleared. You swore to me that you stopped gambling entirely. Derek stumbled backward. His face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of red. He looked around wildly at the vast sea of staring faces, his eyes begging for an escape route that simply did not exist. "Keep your voice down, Brittany," he hissed desperately, trying to grab her arm to quiet her down. "People are watching us." She ripped her arm away from his grasp, her manic rage escalating with every passing second, completely ignoring the unwritten rules of high society. "Let them watch," she roared, her voice echoing sharply off the high gilded ceilings above us. "Let them see exactly what a pathetic lying loser I married. You gambled away our entire estate. You threw away millions of dollars on sports bets and secret poker games, and now the bank is taking my house. My house, Derek. Where am I supposed to live now? You bankrupted us." The guests in the grand ballroom were absolutely captivated by the spectacular implosion. Women in designer gowns covered their mouths in genuine shock, while men in bespoke tuxedos leaned in closer, completely absorbed by the scandalous display. The Kensington family's reputation, their untouchable facade of multi-generational success and unlimited wealth, was bleeding out onto the polished marble floor for everyone to witness. Thomas did not move a single inch to silence his hysterical daughter. He did not step forward to protect the precious family name or shield Brittany from the judging eager eyes of his peers. He simply stood there staring at the woman he had worshipped and funded for 33 years, seeing her now as nothing more than a biological stranger and a catastrophic drain on his personal resources. He pulled his phone from his tuxedo jacket, his face set in a cold mask of absolute unforgiving rage. He dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear, as he glared down at Barbara, who was still weeping miserably on the floor. "Get me the senior litigation partner right now," Thomas barked into the phone, his voice loud and commanding, ensuring that everyone in the immediate vicinity could hear him perfectly. "I do not care what time it is. Wake him up immediately. I want divorce papers drafted and filed by morning. I want every single asset frozen. I want her completely locked out of the estate tonight." Barbara let out a fresh, agonizing wail, burying her face in her diamond-covered hands. Brittany whipped her head around, her attention snapping away from her ruined husband and locking onto her father. She stared at Thomas, completely bewildered by his vicious, unprompted decree. "Dad, what are you doing?" Brittany cried out, rushing toward him in a sheer panic. "You have to help us. You have to call the bank and fix this mess. Derek ruined everything. You need to write a check. You need to save my house. I cannot be homeless." Thomas looked at her with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. "I am not writing you a single check ever again," he sneered, his words slicing through the tense air like a physical blade. "You are not getting another dime of my money. You are not inheriting my company. You are not even my daughter. Get out of my sight." The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, hanging on every single word. Brittany froze in her tracks, her perfectly styled hair falling messily into her face as her father's brutal words echoed in her ears. She looked at Thomas, waiting for the punchline, desperately waiting for him to take it back and fix her broken world. But Thomas merely held up the crushed, damp pages of the genetic analysis I had given Barbara, violently waving the undeniable proof in the air for all to see. "Ask your mother," Thomas spat, turning his back on Brittany completely and walking away into the crowd, still aggressively shouting instructions to his lawyers over the phone. Brittany slowly turned her gaze down to the floor, where Barbara was curled into a pathetic, sobbing ball of emerald satin. The realization hit Brittany with devastating world-ending force. The special treatment, the lavish gifts, the overwhelming favoritism she had enjoyed her entire life had all been built on a massive, unforgivable lie. She was not the golden child of the Kensington Empire. She was a living, breathing secret. Her entire identity, her social standing, and her immense sense of superiority had been instantly incinerated. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic, her hands curled into tight, trembling fists at her sides. "You lied to me!" Brittany screamed a raw, primal sound tearing from her throat. She lunged forward, throwing herself at Barbara with terrifying speed. She grabbed her mother by the shoulders of her ruined gown, shaking her violently as the remaining shards of their family shattered into pieces. "Who is he?" Brittany demanded, sobbing hysterically as she towered over her weeping mother. "Who is my real father, Barbara? Tell me the truth right now. Tell me who I really am." The Kensington family turned entirely on each other, tearing themselves apart in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by the horrified stares of the city's elite. I watched the glorious chaos unfold with absolute tranquility, knowing my ultimate victory was finally complete. The toxic, abusive empire they had built together was entirely dismantled. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind and absolutely nowhere left to run. The sounds of Brittany screaming at her mother echoed off the crystal chandeliers. She was demanding a name, demanding to know the identity of the man who had actually fathered her, but Barbara could only choke on her own breathless sobs. The emerald satin of Barbara's gown was torn at the shoulder, a casualty of Brittany's violent grip. High society guests, the very people Barbara had spent 3 decades trying to impress, stood in a wide, horrified circle around our alcove. They held their phones up, capturing every miserable second of the Kensington matriarch groveling on the wet marble floor. Nobody stepped forward to help her. No one offered a comforting hand. The elite social circle that had attended her lavish charity galas now looked at her as if she were a diseased animal. Barbara looked up through her ruined makeup, her chest heaving as she registered the totality of her isolation. Her husband of 35 years was marching away through the crowd, barking legal orders to strip her of every asset she had ever known. Her precious golden child, the daughter she had protected above all else, was standing over her, her face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. Derek was leaning against a pillar nearby, staring at his phone with dead eyes as he watched the foreclosure alerts pop up on his screen. Barbara had sacrificed her moral compass to secure her wealthy existence, and in the span of a single evening, it had all turned to ash. Her frantic gaze darted around the alcove, searching for a lifeline. Her eyes finally locked onto me. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, and my expression unreadable as I watched her process the reality of my new position. I was the only person left in the room who possessed the capital to stop the bleeding. I was the billionaire. I was the sole owner of the corporate debt that was swallowing her husband alive. The desperation that washed over her face was profoundly validating. She pushed herself up onto her knees, her diamond bracelets clinking against the hard floor. "Vanessa," she cried out, her voice a ragged plea that cracked with every syllable. "Vanessa, please. You have to stop this. You have the money now. You can fix it. You can pay off the loans and make Thomas stop. He will listen to you now." She began to scramble toward me, crawling across the wet marble, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. "Please," she wailed, tears carving dark tracks down her cheeks. "We are your family. You cannot just stand there and watch us lose everything. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us." She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers stretching to grab the fabric of my silk gown, aiming to pull me down into the wreckage with her. I did not flinch, and I did not reach out to comfort her. I simply took one smooth, deliberate step backward, moving entirely out of her reach. Her hand grasped at empty air, her fingers curling into a tight fist as she slumped forward onto the floor. I looked down at her, feeling no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no obligation. "You did not raise me, Barbara," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the quiet space that had formed around us. "You tolerated my existence because it was legally required of you. You used me as a convenient scapegoat to mask your own monumental guilt. Every time you looked at me, you saw the biological truth that you were denying your husband, and you punished me for it. You let him treat me like a stray dog. You let Brittany mock me. You actively participated in grinding my self-worth into dust just to maintain your precious illusion of a perfect family." I kept my eyes locked on hers, watching the desperate hope drain out of her ruined face. "Family is not defined by blood. and it is certainly not defined by bank accounts. I continued, the truth of my words ringing with absolute certainty. Family is built on a foundation of basic respect. It is built on showing up, on loyalty, and on protecting one another. You and Thomas built an empire on lies, manipulation, and conditional affection. You never respected me, Barbara. You never loved me. And you absolutely never protected me. Thomas had stopped near the edge of the crowd, his phone clutched in his hand as he turned back to witness his wife begging at my feet. The sheer humiliation of the scene seemed to reignite his fury. He shoved his way back through the circle of staring guests, his face flushed a dark crimson. "Get up off the floor, Barbara," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "Stop embarrassing yourself. Do not beg her for anything. She is just as calculating as the rest of you." He turned his furious glare toward me, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to assert some lingering shred of patriarchal authority. "You might have bought my debt, Vanessa," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You might hold the paper, but you do not know the first thing about running Kensington Logistics. You need me. The board will never accept a hostile takeover from someone with zero operational experience. You will tank the stock price by Monday morning. I am the chief executive officer of that company. I built it from the ground up, and you will quickly realize that you cannot navigate this industry without my expertise and my connections." I met his glare with the calm smile. "My company owns the toxic debt, Thomas." I explained, my tone light. "As the primary creditor, the emergency clauses in those contracts grant me immediate voting rights over executive leadership in the event of a financial default, which you are officially in." I took a slow breath, letting the air of victory fill my lungs. "I do not need your expertise, Thomas. I do not need your connections, and I do not need you." I stared directly into his panicked, wide eyes, delivering the final blow. "You are fired, Thomas. Effective immediately. You are no longer the chief executive officer of Kensington Logistics. You no longer have a seat on the board. You no longer have access to the corporate accounts, the company vehicles, or the executive suites. Your badge will be deactivated before you even leave." Thomas gasped in silent horror as he stumbled backward. His hands flew to his chest as if he were having a heart attack. The empire he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect was completely, irrevocably gone. I turned away from the shattered remnants of the Kensington family and looked toward the large mahogany doors of the ballroom. I raised my hand, giving a subtle signal. Instantly, 4 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. They were my private security detail, hired specifically for this exact moment. They moved swiftly, forming a solid, impenetrable wall between me and the screaming mess of my former relatives. I smoothed the skirt of my gown, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. "Please ensure my former relatives find the exit," I instructed the lead security guard, my voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the shocked crowd. "They are no longer on the VIP list." The sharp, frantic sounds of their protests faded behind me. Thomas was still bellowing empty threats about lawsuits and injunctions, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who had finally realized he possessed zero leverage. Brittany was still shrieking, her cries echoing off the gilded ceilings as the reality of her eviction settled in. I did not look back. I simply placed one foot in front of the other, letting the sharp click of my heels carry me away from the dark alcove and toward the grand ballroom. For the first time in 33 years, the suffocating pressure in my chest was gone. The chain that had tethered me to their approval, their conditional affection, and their endless demands had finally been severed. I could hear Thomas bellowing empty threats about massive lawsuits and immediate injunctions, his voice cracking with the terrible strain of a man who suddenly realized he possessed zero leverage. Brittany was still shrieking, her cries echoing off the high, gilded ceilings as the freezing reality of her impending eviction settled deep into her bones. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not slow my deliberate pace. I simply placed one foot in front of the other, letting the rhythmic, sharp click of my heels carry me away from the dark alcove and toward the grand double doors of the main ballroom. For the first time in 33 years, the suffocating pressure in my chest was completely gone. The heavy invisible chain that had tethered me to their toxic approval, their strictly conditional affection, and their endless greedy demands had been cleanly severed. The air in the country club felt crisp and intoxicatingly pure as I glided across the polished marble floor, leaving the smoking ruins of my former life very firmly behind. As I slowly entered the massive ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with an electric, undeniable tension. The new year had just officially finally rung in, but the celebratory mood had been entirely hijacked by the spectacular meltdown that had just unfolded in the foyer. The jazz band was playing a soft, tentative melody, clearly unsure of how to navigate the sudden, awkward shift in the room. Hundreds of Chicago's most elite socialites, the very people my parents had spent decades courting and impressing, parted before me like the Red Sea. They stepped back, giving me a wide, respectful berth, their eyes wide with a potent mixture of awe, burning curiosity, and absolute fear. Whispers rippled through the massive crowd as I passed traveling from group to group as the shocking news of the hostile takeover and the public firing spread like wildfire. I kept my chin high and my posture impeccable, offering polite, serene smiles to the stunned faces I recognized. Women in sparkling designer gowns who had previously ignored me or offered cruel backhanded compliments now looked at me with extremely cautious reverence. Men who had constantly treated me like Thomas's pathetic, overly ambitious shadow now watched me with genuine, unadulterated respect. The power dynamic of the entire city had shifted in a single historic evening. I was no longer the discarded, unloved daughter of the Kensington Empire. I was the lone, brilliant architect of its complete destruction and the absolute, undisputed owner of its incredibly lucrative, valuable remains. I reached the grand, sweeping staircase leading down to the main lobby and descended the carpeted steps with slow, deliberate grace. The lobby was much quieter than the ballroom, the ambient noise thoroughly muffled by thick velvet drapery and heavy wooden doors. I approached the long mahogany coat check counter, intending to retrieve my belongings and disappear into the crisp winter night. I desperately needed a moment to breathe the freezing January air and fully process the absolute magnitude of what I had successfully accomplished tonight. A young attendant scurried to fetch my cashmere coat, her eyes extremely wide, as if she had already heard the incredible rumors circulating upstairs. I thanked her politely, smoothly, slipping the warm fabric over my bare shoulders and adjusting the high collar against the chill. As I turned toward the massive glass entrance doors, the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the lobby was suddenly violently shattered. The heavy glass doors burst open, letting in a bitter gust of freezing wind and a chaotic, aggressive swarm of bright, flashing lights. A massive mob of local reporters and frantic photographers surged into the foyer, their heavy snow boots tracking gray sleet across the pristine, expensive carpets. Microphones were violently thrust forward, and the rapid mechanical clicking of camera shutters created a blinding, disorienting strobe effect all around me. The aggressive local press corps had clearly caught wind of the spectacular, unprecedented family drama and were practically foaming at the mouth for an exclusive, highly anticipated public statement. The sudden, overwhelming barrage of noise was deafening. Miss Kensington, a tall, aggressive reporter near the front of the agitated pack, shouted, his loud voice cutting sharply through the relentless clamor. We just received word that Apex Financial has officially initiated foreclosure proceedings on Derek and Brittany's estate. Can you confirm this? Another frantic, desperate journalist pushed his way forward, almost tripping over a thick, heavy camera cable coiled on the ground. Miss Kensington, what is the exact status of the frivolous lawsuit filed against your algorithm last week? Did your father genuinely drop the case entirely to avoid a devastating federal audit? A third piercing voice cut through the mounting chaos. Are the rumors completely true that you personally purchased the toxic debt of Kensington Logistics tonight? Have you orchestrated a hostile, ruthless takeover of your own father's massive supply chain empire? The incredibly invasive questions hit me like a relentless barrage of heavy artillery, each inquiry confirming that the closely guarded darkest secrets of the Kensington family were now permanent public knowledge. The meticulously crafted generational facade of endless wealth and unbroken flawless success was completely irrevocably gone. It was instantly replaced by the ugly, highly publicized, undeniable truth of their humiliating financial ruin. They desperately wanted to hear all the incredibly ugly, shocking details. They wanted the juicy family gossip, the scandalous, tearful breakdown of the fake golden child, and the utterly pathetic, groveling collapse of the deceitful matriarch. They wanted to smell pure, unadulterated corporate blood. I took a brief moment to slip my arms fully into my expensive cashmere coat, adjusting the dark collar with slow, extremely deliberate precision. I looked out at the massive sea of eager, anticipating faces, the brilliantly flashing cameras, and the dozens of microphones thrust violently toward me. I felt the freezing winter air seeping wonderfully through the open glass doors. I offered a brilliant PR-perfect smile. It was a smile completely devoid of malice, showing only the calm, collected confidence of a seasoned corporate titan who had just closed the most important, lucrative deal of her entire life. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest television camera, ensuring my voice would be crystal clear for the morning broadcasts. Kensington Logistics was poorly managed and heavily burdened by toxic assets. I stated my tone smooth, unwavering, and deeply professional. My firm is simply cleaning house to prepare for a better future. Happy New Year. I turned on my heel and walked out into the freezing Chicago night. The heavy glass doors swung completely shut behind me, finally sealing the Kensington family inside the luxurious tomb they had built for themselves. I stepped into my waiting town car, the quiet luxury of the leather interior, offering a sanctuary of absolute silence. As the driver pulled away from the curb, leaving the blinding media circus far behind, I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The long battle was officially over. I had finally, truly, absolutely won. I opened my eyes, letting the reality of my victory settle over me like a heavy, comforting blanket. The suffocating, stifling atmosphere of the country club was completely gone, replaced by the crisp, cool January night air that filtered through the slightly lowered window of the town car. I breathed deeply, drawing the freezing pure wind into my lungs, and for the very first time in my life, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It was a profound, quiet stillness that washed away 3 decades of relentless anxiety and toxic family expectations. I shifted my weight, sliding deeper into the plush back seat of the waiting car, as my driver navigated the icy, winding driveway of the estate. The heavy tires crunched satisfyingly over the salted pavement, carrying me further and further away from the gilded cage that had imprisoned me for so long. As the car finally pulled away from the massive wrought iron gates merging onto the darkened suburban road, I did not look back at the country club. I did not turn my head to catch one final glimpse of the manicured lawns or the flashing lights of the frantic media circus that was currently dismantling the Kensington family legacy. They were no longer my problem, and they were no longer my family. Instead, I reached into my small velvet clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen was absolutely flooded with notifications. There were dozens of urgent emails from my legal team, frantic voicemails from Apex financial executives, and continuous alerts from my banking applications. I could have easily opened my portfolio app to stare at my $400 million bank balance to visually confirm the staggering absolute transfer of wealth that had just taken place. I could have read the terrified messages from Thomas's former board members, who were already begging for my mercy. But I completely ignored all of the corporate chaos and financial alerts. I swiped away the notifications about stock prices and hostile takeovers. Instead, I opened a simple group text message thread. It was a thread shared between me and 3 other people, my loyal, chosen friends. The people who had loved me when my last name meant absolutely nothing but a source of pain. I looked at the names on the screen: Maya, David, and Chloe. They were the ones who had been there for me during the darkest, most desperate years of my life. When Thomas had first cut me off financially, leaving me to drown in a city that demanded perfection, it was Maya who had let me sleep on a thin, lumpy mattress on the floor of her tiny studio apartment. When I was working 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford community college tuition, eating nothing but cheap instant noodles and stale bread. David and Chloe had constantly showed up with hot meals and fierce, unwavering encouragement. They did not care about the Kensington Empire. They cared about Vanessa. I read the latest message in the chat sent just 5 minutes ago by Maya. The text was simple, unbothered by the massive corporate earthquake I had just caused on the other side of the city. We got the corner booth, the message read, accompanied by a grainy photograph. We are holding the table, and we bought the good stuff. Hurry up, the fries are getting cold. I stared at the photo. It was a picture of a battered Formica tabletop in a small, loud, completely unpretentious diner downtown. Sitting right in the middle of the table was a bottle of incredibly cheap drugstore champagne, chilling in a plastic ice bucket surrounded by heavy ceramic coffee mugs, and a massive plate of greasy French fries. A warm, profound feeling bloomed in the center of my chest. I stared at that slightly blurry image, and I smiled genuinely for the first time all week. It was not the tight, calculated public relations smile I had just given to the cameras, and it was not the cold, victorious smirk I had offered Barbara. It was a real authentic expression of pure joy. I tapped the screen quickly, typing my reply. I am on my way, I wrote. Tell David not to eat all the fries before I get there. I locked the screen and dropped the phone back into my purse, resting my hands in my lap. I looked out the window as the quiet, snow-covered suburbs gradually gave way to the bright, towering skyline of downtown Chicago. The city looked different to me now. It was no longer a daunting, hostile landscape controlled by men like Thomas Kensington. It was just a city filled with millions of people living their lives entirely unaware of the dramatic shift in power that had just occurred. I watched the streetlights pass by in a steady, rhythmic blur, allowing the quiet hum of the car engine to lull me into a state of absolute relaxation. My mind drifted back to the alcove, to the look of sheer, unadulterated horror on Brittany's face when she realized her entire life was a lie. I thought about the desperate, pathetic way Barbara had crawled across the floor begging for a fraction of the mercy she had never once shown me. They had spent their entire lives worshiping the illusion of superiority, building a fortress out of stolen money and genetic deceit. They believed that wealth made them untouchable, that their status shielded them from the consequences of their actions. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of power. True power did not come from inheriting a stolen company or marrying into a legacy of lies. True power came from survival. It came from being stripped of everything, thrown out into the freezing cold, and learning how to build a fire with your own bare hands. The town car slowed as we entered the bustling downtown district. The wide, pristine avenues were replaced by narrow, gritty streets lined with old brick buildings and glowing neon signs. This was a part of the city the Kensingtons completely avoided, a neighborhood they considered entirely beneath their elevated social standing. But to me, this was home. This was where the real people lived, the people who worked hard, paid their debts, and loved each other without demanding a genetic test or a trust fund in return. The driver pulled the long, sleek vehicle up to the curb, parking directly in front of a slightly run-down diner. The neon sign above the door was sputtering, the red light buzzing loudly against the dark winter sky. The windows were fogged with condensation from the heat inside, but I could hear the muffled sounds of loud laughter, clinking silverware, and the classic rock playing on the vintage jukebox. I quickly thanked my driver, grabbed my clutch, and stepped out onto the salted sidewalk. The wind bit my cheeks, but I felt perfectly warm. I pushed the heavy front diner door wide open, instantly greeted by a wall of glorious, welcoming heat, smelling of strong black coffee and frying bacon. The chaotic noise washed over me. Waitresses shouted orders and cooks slammed metal spatulas against the grill. Tucked away in the back corner in a battered red leather booth, I found them. Maya waved wildly. David struggled to open the cheap champagne. Chloe laughed, holding up 4 ceramic coffee mugs for the upcoming toast. I slid into the booth completely surrounded by love, knowing I was finally home. 3 weeks passed since that cold January night in the diner. The dust from the catastrophic implosion of the Kensington Empire had finally settled over Chicago, leaving behind a vastly altered landscape. The swift and brutal dismantling of my former family was not a secret. It was the premier topic of conversation in every boardroom country club and high society dinner party across the city. The toxic system they had carefully constructed and maintained for decades had finally collapsed under its own massive weight, completely crushing them in the process. Thomas was the first to fall from grace. He was no longer the untouchable titan of the logistics industry. Stripped of his company, his assets, and his heavily inflated pride, he was currently residing in a sterile rented two-bedroom condominium on the outskirts of the city. The sprawling historic estate he had once ruled with an iron fist was completely gone, liquidated to cover a fraction of the corporate debt he had recklessly accumulated. He spent his days sitting at a small laminate dining table, drowning in boxes of receipts and financial ledgers. The aggressive IRS audit I had promised him was in full swing, tearing through his personal and professional histories with absolute ruthlessness. Federal agents had frozen his remaining personal accounts, meticulously tracking every hidden offshore transfer and fraudulent tax deduction he had ever authorized. His former peers in the business community refused to take his calls, treating him like a complete pariah. The men who used to beg for his favor now crossed the street to avoid being associated with his monumental disgrace. He was an isolated, angry man entirely consumed by the consequences of his own arrogance. Barbara fared no better in the aftermath. The brutal divorce proceedings Thomas had initiated the night of the gala were moving forward with vicious speed. He blamed her entirely for the public humiliation, using his remaining legal connections to try and leave her with absolutely nothing. Her emerald satin gowns and diamond bracelets were meaningless now. The elite social circle she had dedicated her entire life to cultivating had completely abandoned her. The charity boards she once chaired politely asked for her immediate resignation. Her former friends stopped returning her text messages and deliberately excluded her from their luncheons and charity galas. She was forced to rent a small apartment in a neighborhood she would have previously refused to drive through, entirely cut off from the lavish lifestyle she believed she was entitled to. Without her wealth and her carefully maintained social standing, Barbara had absolutely no identity left. She was simply a lonely woman navigating a vicious legal battle with a man who loathed her, mourning a social status she could never ever regain. The destruction of the Golden Child was perhaps the most spectacular collapse of all. Brittany and Derek were officially completely bankrupt. The foreclosure on their massive estate had moved with terrifying efficiency, forcing them out of the house before the end of January. The endless stream of secret poker games, the millions thrown away on illegal sports bets, and the massive loans Derek had taken out against the property had completely drained them. When the money vanished, so did the last remaining shreds of their marriage. Brittany could not handle the reality of poverty. She packed her remaining designer luggage and moved into a cheap motel, immediately filing for divorce. She blamed Derek for ruining her perfect life, screaming at him in the lobby of their lawyer's office, entirely ignoring the fact that her own immense sense of superiority had been built on a foundation of stolen money. Derek, utterly defeated and facing potential criminal charges for his gambling debts, simply let her go. Their toxic partnership, built entirely on mutual deceit and shallow materialism, had instantly evaporated the second the funds dried up. They had absolutely nothing left to show for their years of extravagant living except empty bank accounts and a mountain of legal paperwork. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. The absolute ruin they were currently experiencing was the direct, unavoidable consequence of their own malicious actions. They had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset, a biological inconvenience they could casually abuse and exploit. Now they were finally experiencing the cold, unforgiving reality of the world they had created. 3 weeks later, I sat in the former headquarters of Kensington Logistics and watched the old silver letters being removed from the side of the building. One by one, the name that had once controlled my life disappeared from the Chicago skyline. The company was mine now. The contracts were signed, the debt was transferred, and Thomas Kensington's empire had officially changed hands. But as I looked at the empty space where his name used to hang, I realized the money was not the real victory. The real victory was not destroying them. It was no longer needing them. My friends were waiting downstairs, laughing in the lobby and arguing over music for the drive to the lake house. I left the takeover documents on my desk, slipped into my coat, and walked toward the elevator. For the first time in my life, I was not walking away from a family. I was walking toward one. The journey from being the forgotten, discarded daughter to the absolute owner of my own destiny taught me a lesson that goes far beyond corporate takeovers or financial revenge. For decades, I allowed myself to be defined by people who were entirely incapable of loving me. I thought that if I just worked harder, achieved more, or proved my worth, I would finally earn the acceptance that had always been withheld. But the truth is, toxic people do not change just because you become more valuable. They simply find new ways to exploit your worth. Realizing that you are sitting at a table where respect is no longer being served is the most painful, yet ultimately the most liberating revelation you can ever have. The moment I stopped fighting for a seat at their table and decided to build my own was the exact moment I truly became untouchable. You do not need the approval of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You do not need permission to walk away from a toxic environment, even if that environment is your own family. Your true worth is not determined by the people who consistently underestimate you. It is determined entirely by your own resilience, your vision, and your unwavering refusal to settle for anything less than what you deserve. Blood may tie people together, but it is shared respect, genuine support, and unconditional love that actually make a family. Share your stories in the comments below about a time you had to walk away from a toxic situation or stand up to people who drastically underestimated your true value. I would love to read about how you found the strength to finally choose yourself and rebuild your reality. If my journey to reclaiming my power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and building the life you truly deserve. Thank you so much for listening, and always remember that sometimes the greatest victory of all is simply realizing that you never needed them in the first place.